This program is a video presentation via Zoom of the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia. Founded in 1951, the Roundtable hosts monthly presentations at a location near Washington, D.C., more recently at the Fort Myer Officers Club. For more information, go to www.cwrtdc.org.
I'm really excited about having Jim speak to us tonight. I spoke to him a few times before. Please feel free to read the intro on our website, but the Reader's Digest version is this. Jim holds history degrees from Rhodes College and the University of Memphis, and he's done postdoc work at the University of Oklahoma and the University of Virginia. After college, Jim served for 3 years in the Air Force as Chief of Air Intelligence. Upon leaving the service, he was recruited by the CIA. He spent 27 years with the CIA, and his career included a variety of operational and management positions and overseas duties, including tours in the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And my brother's in the State Department. Is retired now, but he was glad to have people like Jim helping out our troops out there and our State Department guys. Jim's interest in the Civil War grew out of his experience growing up on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. After retiring from the CIA Senior Intelligence Service in 2005, so he's already spent now 15 or 16 years in retirement doing all kinds of things. He started his own leadership training business. He's conducted over 200 seminars for corporate and government management teams, which feature day-long tours of Civil War battlefields as part of his curriculum. And so maybe be talking about the Battle of Ball's Bluff, but he's done a lot of other things too. I am very glad to welcome Jim to speak to us today. Jim, welcome to our group, and go ahead and take it away.
Kurt, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. We're okay on that? Okay, great. I'm going to share screen here in just a minute, but Kurt, thank you very much. I had forgotten a lot of that stuff. So, but I'm very, very pleased and honored to be here with this roundtable tonight. And I hope I can do our little Battle of Ball's Bluff justice, but I will put in a plug for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI, at George Mason. We have over 1,000 students, and most of the professors are students. And we have a very extensive catalog with lots of courses, mostly during the day. Right now, we're doing most of our courses via Zoom, but we are transitioning this winter to hybrid classes where we'll have some at the campus and as well as some on Zoom attendance. So I would encourage you. It's OLLI at George Mason. If you just Google OLLI at George Mason University, and you can look at the catalog. I'm teaching a course this winter on Christmas during the Civil War, and then we'll probably be doing some in the spring, but as well. But so I'll put in a plug for that, Kurt, since you mentioned it. So thanks very much. So let's go now to Ball's Bluff. All right, this is the picture you're seeing here is a shot of the main core area of the battlefield. It was fought on the 21st of October, 1861. So we're coming up this month on the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Ball's Bluff, and that will be observed at the battlefield on the 23rd. So I'll talk more about that at the end of the lecture. Just a plug for the Friends of Ball's Bluff. I'm a member of that volunteer group that does a number of things on behalf of Nova Parks. So the Northern Virginia Regional Parks Authority, Nova Parks, actually owns and operates Ball's Bluff Battlefield and has done so since about 1984, something like that. It's 123 acres, so it's well beyond the core area of the battlefield, but there's lots of hiking that goes on there as well. As a matter of fact, a lot of us tour guides, we do tour guiding on the weekends, Saturdays and Sundays, from about April through November, I believe. And we often get people who come for a hike and stay for a tour. So it's a great little spot just outside of Leesburg, and I'll get more on that. But Friends of Balls Bluff, our motto is preservation, preserving the battlefield, presentation, and that is telling the story, and partnerships. And we partner with a number of organizations in the area, including, but our primary partnership, of course, is with Nova Parks. And we have been very fortunate. We've been very helpful, I think, with Nova Parks during the pandemic, because of course they've lost a lot of revenue and had to cut back staff. So our guys, most of us are retired, are out there doing tours and doing a mulching of the trails. And we also do an educational program through Balls Bluff Elementary School, where we conduct an essay tour and then an essay contest, nothing like reading essays of fourth and fifth graders, and then evaluating those. But some of them are really very good. So anyway, that's a little bit about Balls Bluff. What I'd like you to keep in mind, and I'll try to stay on time here. I'm notorious for not doing that. So just raise your hand or something if you finally had enough. Three things I want you to remember about the Battle of Balls Bluff. It's a very small battle, took place early in the war. So its significance is not related so much to the number of casualties or the number of troops involved, but it is related, I think, to the timing of the battle, when it took place, which was October of '61, so very early in the war, its location, just across the river from north of Washington, and the repercussions that followed on after the battle, largely political in nature. So it's less than a year since Lincoln's election, and only about 7 months since his inauguration. It's been an incredibly busy time. Of course, we're well aware that 11 states have seceded. Fort Sumter's been fired on. There's already been one major battle. We're raising armies on both sides. But one of the key things to keep in mind is the mood in the capital, the mood in Washington. Well, the mood in both capitals, actually. But the mood in the capital of Washington right now is dark. I mean, it's marked by fear, anger, suspicion. There are rumors of traitors everywhere. And part of that goes back, of course, to the Buchanan administration, just a year previously, when there were four members of the Buchanan administration, the cabinet, who went on to join the Confederacy. The vice president, John Breckinridge, of course, from Kentucky. The treasurer was, Secretary of Treasury was Howell Cobb from Georgia. The Interior Secretary, Jacob Thompson from Mississippi. And the Secretary of War, and he's my favorite in the cabinet, is John Floyd of Virginia. They were all members of the Knights of the Golden Circle, which was, of course, a loose organization of people across the country who were interested in forming a slave nation or a slave state, where they would include the slave states of the South, as well as parts of the Caribbean and even Northern South America. With the exception of Floyd, none of them that we know of did anything in sort of an active sense to aid the Confederacy before secession and them leaving the government. But however, the exception was John Floyd. Floyd, as the Secretary of War, spent months in the waning months of the Buchanan administration transferring weapons to many of the southern forts along the southern coast. So after the War of 1812, we built a number of about 30 forts along the coast, many of them in the slave states of the South, to guard against another invasion. And Floyd was responsible for moving weapons, including large artillery pieces, to those forts, and then transferring the troops who were stationed there outside of the forts elsewhere in the country, making it very easy then as the southern states began seceding in December and then early in 1861 to occupy those forts and to seize all the weapons. So for my money, he probably should have been tried for treason. He was dismissed from the cabinet. But so that gives you an idea of kind of what the mood was like. And I think that's very important to keep in mind when we talk particularly about the repercussions of the battle. Lincoln connections are important. Some of the people that we're going to be talking about that were participants in the battle: Edward Baker, of course, a lawyer originally from Illinois that will be the colonel in charge on the battlefield, a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. We'll talk a little bit more about him. George McClellan has Lincoln connections from his time in the Illinois Central Railroad, when Lincoln was, of course, the corporate attorney there. Charles Stone, the commander, Baker's superior, the commander there, overall commander on the battlefield, who was in charge of the Lincoln inauguration. And both Baker and Stone rode in the carriage with Lincoln to his inauguration, and then Baker introduced Lincoln at his inauguration. So those connections are going to be important. We'll talk more about those. The other thing to keep in mind is it's a small military at the beginning of the war. Only about 17,000 men total, 4 general officers and 19 colonels. General Scott took Mexico with the equivalent of what would have been a division during the American Civil War, about 12,000 men. So there's a lot of growing that has to go on after the first Battle of Bull Run, 21st of July, 1861. So Ball's Bluff is exactly to the day 3 months after the first battle at Bull Run. And of course, in terms of tolerance for failure, McDowell lost his job after one day after the first battle of Bull Run. So keep that in mind as well. So both sides realize that it's going to take time to raise, equip, and arm armies on both sides. Eventually, 2 million men will serve in the U.S. Army and almost 1 million in the Confederate Army. Early on in the war, again, this is one of the 3 things to keep in mind. We still don't have standardization in terms of flags or uniforms. The 42nd New York that was at Ball's Bluff was in gray uniforms. The names of the armies changed. As a matter of fact, the names of both armies that fought here at Ball's Bluff were the Army of the Potomac, which will, of course, change later. Level of command: most of the officers who are going to become generals either had no experience at all. They were political officers, really, because they were looking for a political career after the war. But if they did have experience in Mexico, it was basically at the very lieutenant or captain level. As a matter of fact, I like to quote Dick Ewell, of course, the Confederate general, who said at the beginning of the war, "I knew everything there was about commanding 50 dragoons." So it's going to be very much OJT, and that's going to include at the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Most of the West Pointers were trained as engineers. So that inexperience is something to keep in mind as we go forward. Leesburg. What's so important about Leesburg? Well, the main thing, I think, or one of the main things, is the intersection of the roads. So Ball's Bluff is at the intersection in Virginia, as you can see here. I want to be able to move my cursor around. I hope you can see that all right. I'll circle Leesburg. But it's north of Washington, just across the Potomac, and it's at the intersection of the Alexandria-Winchester Turnpike and Route, which is now Route 7, of course, and Route 15, the Carolina Road running north and south. And that Carolina Road, both roads would become important, particularly if you wanted another way to get to Richmond, as opposed to just the straight route south. Another thing to keep in mind about Loudoun County, where Leesburg is located, is that there were a lot of pro-unionists. It had divided loyalties. During the secession vote in Virginia, there were 1,626 votes. It wasn't a secret ballot, so everybody knew who you were voting for. 1,626 votes for secession, but there were 726 votes against secession, probably the largest single block of anti-secession votes in Virginia. And they were primarily from Leesburg north, in that north central part that you see colored here in red, I guess that is. Mostly Quakers and Germans who had immigrated down from Maryland and Pennsylvania and remained loyal. So from an intelligence standpoint, that's going to become important. Keep that in mind. The key players: George McClellan, everybody's familiar with him, of course, the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, brought in right after the first Battle of Bull Run to, of course, keep Washington safe initially and then pursue the war. His opponent is General Joe Johnston, commander of the Confederate Army of the Potomac, later to become the Army of Northern Virginia. And his headquarters are in Centerville, Virginia, following the first battle at Bull Run. At a lower level, at the more tactical level, outside of Leesburg, at his headquarters at Fort Evans, which is still there, by the way. It was an earthen fort, and it's located only about 1.5 miles from the Balls Bluff battlefield. It is accessible at times. The company that owns it, Rahal, does a good job of protecting it. It's just above the what's now the Leesburg Costco, which of course made a resupply very convenient for the Confederates. Just kidding. This is the man who was in command, Shanks Evans, who's got that 1,000-mile stare. I would not want to have been, I was a lieutenant. I would not want to have been a lieutenant under him, at least not somebody who did something to offend him. He was the commander of the 7th Brigade with only about 3,000 men at Leesburg. And that'll become an issue. His opponent just across on the other side of the river at Poolesville is General Charles Stone. He's commanding the Corps. It's actually a division, but it's called the Corps of Observation, which gives you some idea of what they were doing for most of July, August, and September 1861. He has an initial force of about 5,000 to 7,000 men, which will be increased in numbers. And that becomes part of the issue that caused the Battle of Balls Bluff, and we'll get to that in a second. Of course, I mentioned that Stone has quite a reputation because of his successful job in providing security for the Lincoln inauguration. He's the men that the units that he commanded included the 15th and 20th Massachusetts, the 1st Minnesota, 42nd New York, some New York State militia, and then the California Brigade as well. And we'll be talking about that. There's really no fighting going on at this time. Both sides are equipping, arming, training, and watching each other across the Potomac River. As one diarist said, for that period in late summer, early fall, it was a very civil war. They had kind of declared a truce, and they would talk to each other across the river, that sort of thing. This map is important for you to take a look at. I'll try to use my cursor here. Red is Confederate, blue is Union. Here's Leesburg, where I'm circling, and to the lower right is Washington City. Of course, you've got the Potomac, the Blue Potomac River, the international boundary for 4 years between the United States and the Confederacy. Most of Northern Virginia is now occupied in October by Union troops. Most of the Union troops are on the Virginia side of the river. The exception is Stone at Poolesville with his Corps of Observation that are actually deployed along the river opposite Evans, Fort Evans just outside of Leesburg, and he has only 3,000 men to cover a pretty long stretch. Now, one thing to keep in mind, notice that most Confederate defenders are concentrated around Centerville, the heights of Centerville, and to protect the Manassas rail junction. So the Confederates don't anticipate there's going to be much action here around Leesburg, but they want to try to hold it for as long as they can. So, Shanks Evans is hanging out there a bit, and he's going to become more and more nervous as the situation changes in early October, as Stone is reinforced with Edward Baker's 5,000-man California Brigade. And then also in early October, McCall's Pennsylvania Reserve Division comes across the Chain Bridge, where you see the word Washington, and that is the Chain Bridge, which did exist at the time. And the Pennsylvania Reserves move and set up camp at Langley on the campus of what is now CIA. And a couple of the the brigade commanders there are men whose names will become much more familiar to everyone later in the war. George Meade had one brigade, and John Reynolds had another brigade there. So Evans is getting very nervous, though, as his 3,000 men now are facing more and more troops, a division of the Pennsylvania Reserves already on his side of the Potomac, and At Poolesville, Stone is being reinforced as well, with up to about 12,000 troops now. And then there's a skirmish about the 15th, I think, of October up here near Harper's Ferry. And when Evans hears about the skirmishing well to his north, he's concerned that he may be encircled with troops coming across the river, troops already across the river, and maybe troops coming in from the north. And so on the 16th and 17th of October, Evans gets out of town. He basically takes his entire brigade and moves about 5 to 7 miles south of Leesburg along the Carolina Road to where it crosses Goose Creek, in this area right here where my cursor is. And of course, that's moving him closer to the rest of the army, and he does it without permission. BGT Beauregard, who is his immediate commander, finds out about it and sends him a not so polite note suggesting that he, get back to where he's supposed to be, but that's going to take a little time. However, the initial move away from Leesburg has been observed. And we're pretty sure now there was Sugarloaf Mountain for an observation post here on this side of in Maryland, but we're pretty sure it was an informant, one of those Quakers or Germans pro-Union who saw the movement and found a way to get the word to the Union troops and eventually got to McClellan. So now McClellan's interest is piqued. Could he possibly secure Leesburg, the last Confederate hold along the river, without a fight? But how does he know whether the Confederates are really gone? So one of the first things that McClellan is going to do on the 19th of October, just a couple of days before the battle, is he's going to order McCall's division to move toward Leesburg along Route 7. And they take a couple of days to move there. Reynolds' brigade gets as far as Dulles Town Center, where Dulles Town Center is now, only about 12 miles from Leesburg. Very threatening to Evans if he's still there. No reaction. So then McClellan suggests to Stone maybe a slight demonstration, was the term he used in his orders, by Stone would get a reaction, or they would be able to determine whether the Confederates are still there. And so on the 20th, Stone sends one thing that's very important that McClellan does not tell Stone is that, because he does tell Stone that the Pennsylvania Brigade division has been moved toward Leesburg to provide support, but then he orders McCall to withdraw and move back to Langley, and he fails to tell Stone that he's ordered the Pennsylvania reserves back, so Stone will not have them for support. So on the 20th in the evening, early evening of the 20th, at Edwards Ferry, just 3 miles from Ball's Bluff, here, just outside of Leesburg, Stone orders about 100 men of the 1st Minnesota across in boats to cross the river as a demonstration, and then artillery located on the Pennsylvania side lobs artillery shells over toward the direction of Fort Evans. Again, trying to get a reaction. By this time, Evans is back in position, but he is not reacting. He went to West Point too and is smart enough to know that these are just demonstrations. And so Stone that evening orders the 1st Minnesota back across the river, but he still isn't able to answer his boss's question. He still can't confirm whether or not the Confederates are there protecting Leesburg or not. So here's the site of Edwards Ferry, where the 1st Minnesota crossed. It's now where the River Creek Country Club is now located. It's where Goose Creek flows into the Potomac River. Later on, for those of you who may be aware of this, it's also the site of where most of the Union Army crossed the Potomac on the way to Gettysburg. They threw up 2 pontoon bridges on either side of Goose Creek, and at this spot, most of the Union Army crossed over on the way to Gettysburg. So another spot, another piece of information. Now, so the next thing that Stone is going to, and we're still on the evening of the 20th, he's going to do is he's going to order Colonel Charles Devens, the man you see here in the picture, who's the commander of the 15th Massachusetts, who has troops on Harrison's Island. So now we see Fort Evans, where the red marker is. We see Goose Creek and Edwards Ferry to the right of the map. So that's where the demonstration took place. Leesburg behind Evans here to the west. And then 15th Massachusetts on the island. This island, Harrison's Island, is about 2 miles or more long, and it cuts off, of course, the channel of the Potomac River. So you've got a channel of about 250 yards on the Maryland side, and then, yes, I know all of it's Maryland anyway, and then about 80 to 100 yards to the west, or the Virginia side of Harrison's Island. So he orders Charles Devens to send a reconnaissance patrol up to the Virginia side to recon, to see if he can identify if there are any Confederate troops in the area. So this is a very hurried thing. It happens pretty late in the evening, probably about 10 o'clock to midnight. They find some boats. There's no planning that goes into this. That's something else to keep in mind. They do find a skiff and a small rowboat, I guess you would call it. But they're only taking 20 men. So they managed to get them across after dark. And there's a 100-foot cliff right here that they have to navigate, but they know that there is a path where the creek comes down that they can come up. They navigate it, come up the path, and they find a cart path, and they follow the cart path. This 20-man command on the 15th is commanded by a Captain Philbrick, and they move out through this open area that you saw in the very first picture, along the path, out near the Jackson House, which is still there, and to open fields. And in these open fields, they could see all the way to Leesburg. What they could see in the moonlight was what appeared to be a row of tents, what they assumed to be a row of tents. And that was good enough. They did no further inspection or reconnaissance. They did notice, and they reported back to their boss, Stone. So they had to retrace their steps, go all the way back across the island, and then across to the Maryland side, and then find Stone, who's now moved his headquarters down here to Edwards Ferry. When the information gets to Stone, he thinks, a small camp that might be easily overrun. Maybe I have what he called a nice little military chance. And so at midnight, the reconnaissance turns into a raid. And Stone orders Devens to take half of his regiment, about 300 men, cross over to the Virginia side and raid the camp and destroy the camp. And then Devens has discretionary orders to continue on to Leesburg, or to pull back if he faces opposition that's too strong for him. Now, Stone does do some other preparatory work a little bit. In any case, he starts moving troops toward Harrison's Island on the Maryland side. The 42nd New York, the 20th Massachusetts, and eventually the 1st California will all position themselves opposite Harrison's Island. But that's all for now. Now, this is a view of Harrison's Island from the Virginia side. This is the narrow channel. There has been some rain, and so there's a current here that's fairly swift, and the water is too deep to wade. There are, along this part of the Potomac, almost 19 militarily fordable fords, which is one of the other reasons that Edwards' men were left along the Potomac River, because particularly this time of year, in late summer, early fall, when the water level is down, there's lots of places without bridges that armies could get across the Potomac River. Harrison's Island is not one of them. The river is too deep here to ford. Therefore, boats are going to become important, particularly if you haven't planned to have them in place. Now you've got 300 men to get across. Once you get across, this is the bluff that you're looking at, almost 100 feet high. And so you have to find a way up the bluff, which of course the 15th Massachusetts is able to do, but it takes time. They have a rowboat, a couple of skiffs that can take about 36 men at a time. That's it. That's how many men they can get across the river at one time. So you can imagine how long it's going to take most of the rest of the night to get the 300 men of the 15th Massachusetts across. And then they follow the same route. Here is Harrison's Island in the upper right-hand corner. They cross over. They have to go about 300 yards downstream to find the break in the cliff where they can take this path, the same path that was followed by the Philbrick recon patrol, out into the open area. They get out into the open area beyond the tree, this is heavy tree cover in this area. When they get out of the open, expecting to find a camp, what they find instead is a row of trees. And this gets back to, it's early in the war. Remember, I said it's about timing. Early in the war, very experienced men. Nobody on the Union side at the Battle of Ball's Bluff had seen combat before during the Civil War. All of the Confederate units had participated at various levels at the first Battle of Bull Run, but again, fairly limited combat experience. None on the Union side. So Devens has got a decision to make. What do I do now? Not only is the camp deserted, there's no camp at all, and the way appears to be open to Leesburg, but is it? Now, to provide some protection, a company of about 100 men of the 20th Massachusetts has also come across the river and is kind of guarding the back door to protect Devens' men from surprise. What the commander does do is send patrols upriver and downriver to make sure that there are no Confederates in the area. Well, unfortunately, there are, and they run into Confederates from the 17th Mississippi as they move north along the Virginia side. There's a brief exchange, and then those pickets run quickly back to Fort Evans, only a mile and a half away. And by 8 o'clock in the morning, Evans, the commander of the Confederate forces, knows that there are Union troops on the Virginia side of the Potomac opposite Leesburg. But at the same time that this reinforced patrol is going on, Stone, the Union commander, has sent more decoys across the river 3 miles south at Edwards Ferry. This time it's a group of New York cavalrymen. They will go across the river again to demonstrate and get Evans' attention focused again on Route 7 and that potential crossing there rather than what's going on at Ball's Bluff, which Evans does. Evans does not see Ball's Bluff area as a threat simply because of the logistical challenge of getting large numbers of troops across the river. So now it is about 9 o'clock in the morning, and this man, Colonel Edward Baker, arrives at Stone's headquarters at Edwards Ferry. Baker has the California Brigade, and he is under Stone's command, and he's aware that something's going on, so he reports to Stone's headquarters to see if he can be of assistance. Background of Baker, for those of you who may not know, is that he was a big deal in 1861. Not so much now, but he certainly was then. He is a sitting senator from Oregon, a Republican, so very much in the Lincoln camp, a close friend of Abraham Lincoln. They have Illinois roots. Both of them were attorneys in Illinois early in their careers and became very close friends, so much so that President Lincoln named one of his sons Edward Baker Lincoln. That's how close they were. Baker had left Illinois to follow the gold, and he wound up in California after the gold rush in the 1850s, set up a law office there with a man named Wister. But then he got into politics, was not able to get elected to Congress in California, so he moved north to the new state of Oregon, where he became one of the first 2 senators from Oregon and managed to get back to Washington just in time for the beginning of the Civil War. He has obviously strong Lincoln connections, very interested in keeping California in the Union. And therefore, to do that, he decided to recruit a brigade. It started out being a regiment and eventually became a brigade, which they called the California Brigade, so that California would have some skin in the game. It was logistically impossible to get large numbers of men across the United States in 1860, 1861. So what they did was they recruited first in New York and then more successfully in Philadelphia. They started out with a regiment, wound up with 4 regiments. So the California Brigade is actually 4 regiments of Irishmen from Philly. Got that? Okay. So Baker reports to Stone's headquarters to see if he can be of assistance. Stone sees him as somebody, as an answer to his prayer, if you will, because Stone needs to know what's going on at Ball's Bluff. He knows that 300 men are across the river. He has no idea whether there's been any shooting. There has been, but he doesn't know it yet. So he orders Baker to go to Harrison's Island to take command on the field to determine what to do next. And he is given written discretionary orders to send more men across or pull back the entire expedition and forget the whole thing. Baker is now in charge at Harrison's Island. As he is riding to the Maryland side to go across to Harrison's Island, he runs into a courier from Colonel Devens, who's with the 15th Massachusetts. This is Lieutenant Howe, and Lieutenant Howe informs Baker that there is fighting going on, that they have been discovered, and that the 15th Massachusetts is now engaged. It's skirmishing. It's not terribly heavy, but he is engaged with elements of the Confederates in Evans' command. So Baker decides on his authority to continue to send units across the river. So he orders the 1st California, the 1st regiment of his California brigade, as well as the 20th Massachusetts, Cogswell's 42nd New York, all to cross Harrison's Island and then Harrison's Island to Virginia. The problem is they're a little short of boats. They have 3 boats. They eventually get another boat across the island to the Virginia side. So there's 4 small boats to ferry troops across. And they managed to get 3 or 4 boats from the Maryland side to ferry troops that are still on the Maryland side off across to Harrison's Island. They have to cross the island and then get on boats again and move from there. Then Baker, in my view, makes a critical mistake. He stays on Harrison Island. He does not go across to the Virginia side and assume command on what will become, or what has already become, a battlefield. Nor, importantly, does he identify any of the other colonels who are with these regiments to take command. So not Devens, nor Wister or Cogswell or Lee, none of them. They're crossing with their men, but as far as they know, Baker is still in charge, and he spends the next 3 hours trying to find boats, which is a good idea, but it's something he probably should have delegated to a junior officer. It will take, despite his best efforts, it's still going to take almost the rest of the day, almost 8 hours, to get all the Union troops who will eventually participate in the battle across to the Virginia side. So back to the battlefield now. It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Devens is experiencing increasing pressure. He is out here to the far left of the map, and finally at 2 o'clock he decides to pull back. With the 8th Virginia has arrived on the battlefield. These are local boys. Shanks Evans has sent them now to reinforce, because Evans is becoming more and more concerned that the threat may actually be coming from the Ball's Bluff area, because there's not much activity down 3 miles south at Edwards Ferry. So he begins feeding, meaning Shanks Evans, begins feeding more troops from his headquarters at Fort Evans toward Ball's Bluff. The first to arrive to reinforce is the 8th Virginia under Epet Hutton. They have about 350 men. They engage the 15th Massachusetts, and then there's kind of a lull in the fighting from about 1 o'clock in the afternoon until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So at 2 o'clock, Devens pulls back his 15th Massachusetts and arrays them at kind of right angles to the rest of the Union units that are now arriving. The 1st California, 20th Massachusetts, 42nd New York, and now the 15th Massachusetts. Baker now arrives, and he's on horseback. He comes over with his horse. He makes the same route up the bluff and arrives on the battlefield also about 2 o'clock and confers with the other commanders on the field. And then by about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the last commander to arrive is the commander of the 42nd New York. And he also brings along the last artillery pieces. They do manage to get 3 artillery pieces across the river and up the bluff. 2 12-pounder mountain howitzers, not too bad. They've got enough men to lift those up, but they actually bring a caisson and horses to haul the James gun, the 12-pound James gun, up the bluff. What they failed to do is bring much in the way of ammunition They're also well within the range of Confederates, so the gun crews are not going to last very long. So artillery doesn't play much of a role in the battle. Baker is informed that his left is vulnerable. There's a deep ravine here where you see the word Baker and where it says deep ravine. That would be a perfect place for Confederates to flank him. And he also, when Cogswell arrives, Cogswell also recommends that the better ground would be forward. Rather than being pressed against the bluff, they need to move forward to the high ground here where it says 18th Mississippi. He isn't aware, nobody is aware, they know there are Confederates there, but they don't know how many. So Baker orders a patrol forward to recon that position. He sends about 180 men of the 1st California, where you see moving up the bluff, moving up through the open field, up to the high ground here, where the 8th Virginia has taken position, but they can't see the 8th Virginia. Well, Colonel Hutton's 8th Virginians rise up and fire a volley when the California patrol gets close, and then there's close hand-to-hand combat that you see here from an artist's conception of what it was like. And both the 1st California takes almost 100 casualties within a few minutes. The Virginians also suffer 30 to 40 casualties. And the Californians fall back, as do a number of the 8th Virginians. Remember, again, it's early in the war. It's hard to keep people organized. It's also very hard to command in the smoke and noise on a Civil War battlefield. So the 8th Virginia pulls back as well, which leaves a gap. That gap is quickly filled by the next unit that Evans has sent forward, and that is the 18th Mississippi. The 18th Mississippi under Erasmus Burt will fill in that void and then immediately attack toward the Union lines. Now I'm going to go back to the map here very quickly. The problem is the 18th Mississippi is going to attack right because of the terrain. They can see the Union troops that they think they're facing here, the 1st California and the 20th Massachusetts. Because the 15th is back in the woods, they do not see them, and they charge right into the V, and of course suffer heavy casualties and immediately fall back. Burt is among those who is mortally wounded, and so the 18th Mississippi divides into two, realizing that a frontal attack was not a good idea, and they move to the ravines to the flanks of the Union position. It's now about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Baker is now on foot, but he's out in front of the lines trying to order reinforcements from his right to cover his threatened left, when he is hit multiple times, probably by Confederates from the 18th Mississippi. Now, Jim Morgan, who has written the book on the best book on Ball's Bluff, and I'll talk about that in a minute, has researched this, and he has reported 44 eyewitness accounts of how Baker died, and very few of them agree with each other. What we do know is that Baker was hit multiple times, at least 4 times in the head and in the chest, and died immediately. There's a fight over his body. The Union troops go forward and recapture his body and take it to the rear. But now the commander on the field is dead, and a sitting senator is dead. The other colonels quickly consult to see who now is in command, and it turns out to be Colonel Cogswell of the 42nd New York. It's getting late in the afternoon, probably dusk was 5:23. I checked it out. So it's getting almost dark. Cogswell still thinks he might be able to break out. So he consolidates his remaining troops to try to make a forward attack. Unfortunately, at about that time, the last Confederate units to arrive on the battlefield, the 17th Mississippi, have arrived and have arrayed in line of battle. At about 6 o'clock, the Confederates finally get organized, and they launch a 1,000-man attack that you see here in red. Cogswell realizes he's not going to be able to withstand it, and he orders his 42nd New York to be the rear guard, and he starts evacuating men the only way that they can leave, which is back down the bluff and into the water. The last troops to arrive on the battlefield are two companies from the 42nd New York. They become the rear guard. Thanks, guys. We're glad you're here. Your job is to stop 1,000 Confederates long enough for us to evacuate. Every single member of that rear guard becomes a casualty, killed, wounded, or captured. Most of them are captured. The site going down the hill is a route, as you can see from this artist's conception. Federal troops go back the way they came. Nobody went over the cliff. They went back the path that they had come up on. Confederates pursue them and fire down on them. Many of them have great coats. They go into the water, some of them still carrying their weapons. Many of them can't swim and drowned in the water. Many of them also panic. They start loading the wounded, as you see here in the right-hand side, into the couple of the larger boats. But then panicked soldiers quickly swamp those boats. And many of the men go into the water. A number of the Union troops then, remember, it's dark now. A number of the Union troops will go north, upriver, and some will turn and go south, following the bank, hoping to find another place to cross. In the dark, about 400 of them, at least, move up against the bank of the Bluff to get out of the line of fire of the Confederates. They eventually will surrender to the Confederates, and they are marched to Leesburg. They're held overnight in the Leesburg courthouse lawn area. And then the next morning, they're taken under guard. They're marched under guard, and many of them are wounded, to Manassas Junction, where they're put on a train, and they're taken to Richmond, where they're imprisoned. And they will be held until they can be exchanged. And in some cases, it's 3 or 4 months before they are able to be exchanged. Excuse me. Here you see another artist's conception. To give you an idea, there were embedded reporters that reported. They weren't actually on the battlefield, but they were on Harrison's Island. One man in particular from the New York Times was able to get dispatches out the very next day. So word got out very quickly. And because of the ramifications, the political ramifications of this battle, the press reports were worldwide. This is actually from a German newspaper, this artist's conception. And it's not bad. You can see the Union soldiers here who've managed to get onto Harrison's Island. You can see the Confederates firing down on the Union soldiers still trying to flee. It was a disaster for the Union, for the United States. Of the roughly 1,700 men, there were about 1,700 men on each side. Very few of them, they were not all there at once. Both sides were feeding men into the battle during the course of the day. But of the 1,700 Union troops, 223 killed, 226 wounded, 553, most of them captured. Confederates' losses are comparatively light, only about 50 killed, 100 or so wounded, and a couple of captured. I really don't know with this Union rout how any Confederate was captured, but apparently they were. And these numbers, by the way, are not precise. They're about as close as we can get. But as I hope most of you realize, numbers, casualty numbers in any Civil War battle are estimates at best. There is a federal cemetery. Some of the bodies were retrieved the day after the battle under a flag of truce. Some they were able to bury on site, but that action was disrupted. So most of them were not buried until after the war ended. This is the third smallest federal cemetery in the United States. It is not part of Nova Parks. It is a federal cemetery. There are 54 Union remains, but only 24 markers, and only one of them is known. Most of the rest of them are unknown. There were some notables on both sides at the battle. Oliver Wendell Holmes was in the 20th Massachusetts, which of course was the Harvard Regiment, along with two grandsons of Paul Revere, Major Paul Revere and Surgeon Edward Revere. The Confederates also had a couple of congressmen. Featherston, Barksdale, and Captain Brown were all in the U.S. Congress and then served in the Confederacy as well. As a matter of fact, Brown was also a senator and the governor of Mississippi at one time. And these regiments that you see that we talked about here, the Mississippi and the 8th Virginia and the Massachusetts and New York and California Brigade, which will become the Pennsylvania Brigade, all will meet again at Antietam and at Gettysburg. Well, it doesn't take long for the blame game to begin. After all, we've lost a battle right outside of Washington. We've lost a sitting senator, the only time a senator has ever been killed in battle, while also a senator. In their after action reports, both Charles Stone, you see here, and McClellan basically placed the blame or the responsibility, if you will, on Baker, who was under orders and on the field in command, with discretionary orders to continue the fight or to retreat as he saw fit. And he prosecuted the battle. But Baker is a dead hero. He is now a martyr. Plus, the radical Republicans in Congress are going to look elsewhere. They are not going to blame Baker. However, they do form, and this is one of those political repercussions, they do form something known as the Committee on the Conduct of the War, the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, that's led by Ben Wade of Ohio. There are 7 members from both the House and the Senate, and they do include Democrats as well as Republicans. One of the Democrats, as a matter of fact, was Andrew Johnson. The committee will serve throughout the war, but right now they're focused on First Manassas or Bull Run and on Ball's Bluff. They find a couple of junior officers who Stone had reprimanded and disciplined and therefore have a grudge against Stone to testify against Stone, claiming that Stone is pro-slavery and pro-Southern, and that he's one of those traitors. Remember, I told you about early on about the atmosphere in Washington, particularly among the radical Republicans. And so, and McClellan knows that if it's not going to be Baker, it's going to be either McClellan or Stone. And McClellan decides it's not going to be McClellan. So Stone is where most of the focus for the blame goes. Nothing happens, however. He testifies in December and January. But then finally, in February the 8th, Stone is arrested and taken secretly at night. He has to pay for his own train ticket, by the way, to New York City, where he is imprisoned in Fort Lafayette on an island in New York Harbor, and he is held incommunicado for 6 months. That's not quite incommunicado, but he's held without charges for 6 months. He does eventually get help from friends who managed to get him released. He's demoted. He does go back into command, but his career, for the most part, is over. Yeah, it's not McClellan's finest moment, and it's not Lincoln's finest moment either. Lincoln could have reached out possibly to help Stone. However, it's also important to keep in mind what else was going on, what else Lincoln had on his plate. He was dealing with a corrupt Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, who was eventually dismissed and replaced by Edmund Stanton, and that happens in January. And also in January and February, both Willie and Tad, Lincoln's sons, come down with typhoid. And then in late February, Willie sadly will die. So Lincoln is very much distracted at this time, and I think that had some to do with it. So some of the key points to remember, and I'll wrap this up here very quickly. Timing, as I said, it's early in the war. Inexperienced, amateurs, even those with West Point training, very poor communications, particularly on the Union side, because of the terrain and because this was not planned. This was an accident. Location, it's on the doorsteps of the Capitol. There's intense press coverage. Newspapers are getting the word out almost immediately. And the impact, mostly political, of course, Baker killed, a Confederate victory, another one, the creation of the Joint Committee, and Stone becomes a scapegoat. And then one other thing, I think, from a leadership standpoint, because I did a lot of leadership training by using Civil War battlefields as examples. And I wish I had used Ball's Bluff, but I never did because it wasn't until after I stopped that part of my business that I started working with the volunteers at Ball's Bluff. But a friend of mine, another volunteer, Robert Glenn, came up with these, and I'll let you read these for just a second. I think this is a great sort of backwards look at the leadership lessons from the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Okay. And with that, oh yes, Jim Morgan, if you want to read more, this is by far and away the best book on the Battle of Ball's Bluff. Jim Morgan, former Marines, retired State Department employee. Sadly for us, he's moved to Charleston, South Carolina a couple of years ago, but he was one of the founding members of the Friends of Ball's Bluff. And he wrote this book about 2004, and then it was up, there's a new edition came out in 2011. But again, A Little Short of Boats is a perfect way to describe the battle. So with that, you're invited to our tour at 11 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, October 23rd. Will also be the day that we, Friends of Ball's Bluff and Nova Parks, will be observing the 160th anniversary. And so right after our tour is over, probably 45 minutes to an hour, but we can do longer if you like, there will be the Monocacy Union Fife and Drum Corps that will be leading in. We will have reenactors that will put on a skirmish at noon. There will be a musical concert by musicians from the university. And there will be a cannon firing demonstration. And then we will have luminaries lining that same cart path, which is still there, on the way to the cemetery that evening. So with that, let me see if I can stop screen share. And I'm happy to take some questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Jim. That was excellent. Thank you very much for a great presentation. I particularly enjoyed that last page that talked about the various deficiencies. And certainly one of those for me was Stone sent Baker across Harrison Island. And Baker, I guess he didn't think that he would have to worry about an exit strategy, because when you're rushing to get back, and it was already tough to get there in the first place, recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And maybe that's because Baker was not trained. We do have some questions about the training of Baker. Let's go ahead and call on the folks there. David Saylor asked if he had any significant training, and Admin, who I'm not sure who Admin is, but answered that he had commanded the 4th Illinois in Mexico and did well, but he had no formal training. Maybe you can add to that.
Yeah, he was actually second in command in Mexico. The colonel in command was wounded or out of action, and he did lead a charge. So he did have combat experience of about 1 hour. I think, oh, Jim Morgan is on. All right, hey, Jimbo, good to see you. So I got the guy who wrote the book, just in case I get anything wrong here. But Baker had no formal training. So he did have some combat experience commanding volunteers in Mexico, but very limited. And again, we're talking about making it up as you go along. I think Baker saw a problem. There was no question that the boat, the lack of transportation, was a problem. And he chose to focus there and got distracted. And didn't think to put anybody in charge. He wasn't really, there was a lull in the fighting too about this time. And so there was a lot of firing going on. And he may have been lulled into a false sense of security as to what kind of threat his troops were on or under up on the bluff.
All right, Carl Garman has a question. Carl, do you want to open your mic and go ahead and ask that?
Greetings, Mr. Anderson. Question about the, you alluded to the political repercussions and the eventual setting up of the Joint Committee of the Conduct in the War.
Yeah.
Could you? I'm interested in the emotional impact of the aftermath of the battle and what that had upon the people, the reporting, and the political mood in Washington. Like, can you talk a bit about the bodies,
Sure.
gear floating downstream, and kind of how that
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Interplayed with everything.
Right. Absolutely. I cut the aftermath short just to get us into the questions, but I'm glad you asked it. Yes, bodies floated down the river past Washington. I think some bodies got as far south as Mount Vernon. So not only were they getting emotional newspaper reporting from a number of correspondents very, very quickly. Within, like I said, there were reports in the New York Times the next day. And of course, every newspaper back then had an angle. There was no newspaper pretended to be fair and balanced, or whatever you want to call it. And so, of course, the Confederate papers are crowing about another great victory, but on the Union, it's very dark. The mood is very dark. It doesn't take them long at all. I think early December, maybe even late November, they set up the Joint Committee very quickly. And they start calling witnesses very quickly. Baker lay in state in the rotunda of the Capitol. He has a formal funeral in Washington. He has another funeral in New York and another funeral in Philadelphia. And then he is eventually, I don't know too much about how he wound up in the Presidio. Part of it is, I think there were so many people claiming him. Illinois wanted him, Oregon wanted him, California wanted him. I think that they wound up, okay, the Presidio, that's a military cemetery. And so that's where his body is in the Presidio. But he was a big deal. He introduced the president. He was one of the outstanding public speakers of his day. So Baker was really very well known. His death was a huge blow and a huge news story. So thanks for asking the question.
John, Ciccone, as a matter of fact, said that there's a statue of Baker in Statuary Hall in the Capitol.
Yes, yes, that's right. Oh, and I have to say, as a tour guide as Ball's Bluff, when you can actually run into somebody who was a relative of one of the participants in the battle, it's always kind of exciting. And this past Saturday, and I'm not making this up, I actually gave a tour to the great-great-granddaughter of Edward Baker. She and her husband went through the entire tour, did not identify themselves. They were in town. Their daughter was doing a jumping competition at Morven Park. And so afterward, they did reveal their identity. And that was a real pleasure. Unfortunately, they live in Spokane, Washington. So they're not very accessible, but that was really kind of a hoot.
Well, and Steve Conair is, if you want to open your mic, if you have any follow-up questions, but he asked whether Baker's death led to congressmen being banned from serving in the military.
Yeah, technically, the Constitution prohibits sitting senators or congressmen from holding other senior positions. I forget the exact wording, which would include being a military officer. It was sort of honored in the breach. However, excuse me, with Baker's death, it became much more of an issue, especially with so many on the Union side, not so much on the Confederate side. They didn't last long enough, but certainly on the Union side, you had guys clamoring for a colonelcy so that they could make a name for themselves and run for office. And if you look at the presidency after the Civil War, up until, I don't know, Wilson, I guess, there were no Democrats other than Grover Cleveland. They were all, and almost all of them, except for Teddy Roosevelt, were Civil War generals.
John, anything that you'd like to ask?
Was Stone, as I understand it, he retired at one point. He was concerned about the number of Southern sympathizers in Washington right after Fort Sumter. And I think he had been around and he talked to some, he got the sense that about 2/3 of the people in Washington, if you will, were Northern supporters. But that would have left about 20,000 who were questionable. And he went about reorganizing some of the militia units.
Yeah, that's all very true. Thank you. That's a very good point. Washington was a nest of spies and Southern sympathizers. And Stone, in addition to security, it wasn't just security for the inauguration. It was also security for Washington itself, military security. The Washington police force, I'm not even sure they were armed at this time. They did exist, but they might have had clubs or something. But there were, I don't know about numbers. I don't know if anybody really does know numbers, but there were certainly a lot of Southern sympathizers and early on, Governor Letcher of Virginia and others were sending spies. They were recruiting and sending spies into Washington to collect information. So Stone was very much involved in that, very worried about it. And so the accusations of his being pro-slavery were kind of ginned up because apparently he did return some slaves, escaping slaves, but at the time they were still considered property. This was very early on. And he was pretty much doing what he was required to do. But of course that was used against him by the radical Republicans. After the war, I should say, Stone retired in 1864, I believe. He did get a job later on in Egypt. At that time, Egypt was occupied by the Ottoman Empire, and he became sort of the chief of staff of the Ottoman army in Egypt, and served there for 10 years. And then returned to the United States in the 1870s and he became the chief engineer for the erection of the Statue of Liberty, the building of the monument's base, and then the erection of the Statue of Liberty. And then he died, I think, very, very shortly after the Statue of Liberty went up. So that's kind of the rest of the Stone story. Yeah.
But he was an intimate of General Scott.
Okay.
And that did nothing to influence the Committee on the Conduct of the War or whatever, that he was not a Southern sympathizer?
The committee was pretty determined who they were going to blame. I have not done a lot of research on I have it, but I have to admit I haven't read all the testimony that Stone gave. The testimony I read was pretty convincing. So I think they weren't going to be persuaded by logic or by facts. They wanted somebody's scalp, and it was going to be Stone.
Not much has changed.
Welcome to Washington, right?
Well, just kind of a follow-up. If you're military trained, what was the logic in going across at Harrison Island? The topography seemed very, very tough. And if there were other points to cross, was it an element of surprise that they were trying to create? But
well, remember, all they're trying to do at the start of this thing is find out if the Confederate troops are still in the area, if the brigade has left, St. Stephen's Brigade. So it's just a recon by 20 guys. And yeah, sure, let's do it where we will be least expected, right? Well, who would be crazy enough to send across a force, maybe scouts, but who would be crazy enough to send a force across at Harrison Island? Because there are fords, and they have the ability to cross down at Edwards Ferry, and they already have quite a few troops already on the Virginia side of the Potomac River. So it was a scout or a recon that turned into a raid, that turned into a reinforced raid, that turned into a battle that wound up being a defeat, all in the matter of about 4 or 5 hours. I wish I could put back up that last slide about how to be a poor leader, because they made just about all the mistakes you can make.
well, I guess that the Battle of Ball's Bluff became a teaching tool in the future, or after that, I guess, for training. Well, that was a wonderful presentation, Jim. Thank you very much for.
You're most welcome. If anybody is it, please, I think you have my email address. If you're interested in attending, we'd like to get an idea. Tony and I would like to get an idea of how many are coming. The more the merrier, but if you could send me an email, let me know if you're coming. You don't have to tell me if you're not coming, but if you're coming, just send me a quick note. If you use Google Maps and just Google Balls Bluff Battlefield Park, you'll find it. You'll find your way there.
All right. Next email that I send out, I'll ask folks to RSVP. I'm not sure I put that in the last email. But
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. I know everybody's mic is closed and you'd be getting a lot of applause. So thank you very much. And
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, everybody. I hope to see you at the battlefield.
oh, as by the way, one last thing. Does Jim want to say anything about his book?
Oh, Jim Morgan?
Yeah.
It's a great book. Seriously. I assume it's still available on Amazon.
Yeah, it's on Amazon. It's out of print. but it is still available on Amazon, so you can still get it. So, yeah, and nicely done, by the way. Good program, good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. And I hope to have you cover one of your other topics because I know you do quite a few. So I appreciate it. Thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Don't forget to renew. Have a good evening, and let's go get some dinner now.